Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining the Contemporary Issues Forum. I'm Loretta Garcia, one of the co-chairs, and I will turn it over to Dale, who will introduce the next session and then be the moderator for today's session.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Put in your calendar January 15th. We will have a presentation on global food developments, how they affect you. And we'll be welcoming Kevin Cleaver, who was #2 in charge of programming at the International Fund for Agricultural Development, or IFAD. That's a UN agency. And prior to that, he held senior positions in the World Bank on environment and agriculture. Notably, also, he and his wife run a farm in Peru, so he walks the talk. Among other things, he will talk of some remarkable innovations on food processing, so it should be really interesting. Okay, today you are part of an experiment. True to our name, Coffee, Controversy, and Conversation, we are trying a debate format. Both of our debate participants have extensive experience in economic development in poor countries, having worked for international organizations, non-profit organizations, and the private sector. E.J. Ashbourne currently is Executive Director of the Partnership for Quality Medical Donations, or PQMD. One mission of PQMD is precisely to set standards for in-kind donations from medical companies. Before that, she worked 17 years for the World Bank and was notably in a senior position in a joint health metrics program between the World Bank and the World Health Organization. Steve Hansch is currently a professor of public health at GW and a fellow of the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown. He also consults at various organizations and serves on the board of several NGOs. As part of this work, he visited over 90 refugee camps. As full disclosure, I know these two well, although they did not know each other before this debate. Today, for full disclosure, I am a trustee of the NGO Partners for Development, for which Steve has been a trustee for over 20 years, and I'm an advisor for PQMD. Also, EJ and I collaborated on public-private partnerships at the World Bank. Okay, here's the format of today's program. It will be a friendly debate, I hope, and we will use the polling function of Zoom to advantage to get the audience involved and to also check our learning and how our opinions change. So first we'll do the polls. Then each speaker will have an opening statement of about 9 minutes. And then at their request, they get to ask each other a couple of questions. After that, the audience's questions will be entertained. And please do indicate in the chat box to whom you are addressing your question. It's okay to indicate that it's relevant to both. And don't worry, I've allocated 15 to 20 minutes for you to have your questions answered. Now, finally, the polls will be repeated and we will see what have we learned and have opinions been swayed. After that, we will close the recording, but if there are further questions, the speakers have agreed to stay a bit longer and we can go to live questions. So it should be fun. Let's get started. EJ, over to you.
I thought we were going to do the polls first.
Oh, you're right. Let's do the polls. Okay, so please, this is the first question of 4. Please indicate. I have trouble seeing the circles, but okay. So we have 40. I think that's everybody. Okay, here's the second poll. Okay. The third question. No. Here, the third question. A factual one. And EJ will address this later. And is there one more question, Natalie?
Yes, here it is.
Here's the sort of summary question. Okay, well, you've seen the results. It's instantaneous. That's one of the advantages of Zoom. I think what this means is that we can all benefit from the two presentations coming up. So
I didn't actually see the results, but can you put the results back up? They were up for like a second. Okay, there we go. Okay. Thanks. Great, thank you.
do you need to see them for all four? Okay, here we
Yeah.
go. All right. Poll 3. And poll 4. That's imposed storage and logistical costs. Yeah. Okay. We will again revisit the polls and I will comment more at the end. Okay, let's put the spotlight on EJ and take it away.
All right, thank you. I clearly have my work cut out for me. I'm going to start with a number, and the number is 274. And 274 is the million people in 2022 who need humanitarian assistance protection. And that is the highest in decades. And that's just for 24 of the world's most major humanitarian crises. So that's a lot of people, 274. Whoa, the polls are going crazy. Okay, so I have found—
I'm trying to remove them. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's just reminding me how much work we have to do today. Anyway, I have found that everyone has an opinion about donations, whether they be medical or not. And when you consider whether they are good or bad, people have an opinion about that too. And donations can reflect the best of human nature. People are hurting, and each of us wants to do something. We get together in our communities, churches, offices, or elsewhere and organize to send teddy bears, clothes, food, money, medicine, lots of other things. While this is all incredible and generous, it is often this desire to do anything for anyone who is in crisis that causes disruption and sometimes calamity. For example, in the immediate aftermath of the Haiti earthquake, the airport in Port-au-Prince was completely clogged with pallets of all kinds of donations that included ice skates, toys, kitchen utensils, and sneakers, among many other things, blocking the arrival of critically needed infrastructure repair and medical supplies. And when it comes to medical triage for any large-scale population, those donations have to be the right ones for the right people and be put into the hands of those that know how to manage the splints, administer the treatments, and save the lives of as many as possible. So how can we be sure that medical donations are being given and received the way they are intended? Now, donations have long moved past the helicopter drop of random products, and countries are far more sophisticated now about what they accept and under what terms they receive medical product donations. Today, medical product donations are mostly done in response to an expressed need from a Ministry of Health or other authority on behalf of populations with no capacity to pay, or when market-based solutions are inadequate or unavailable. Donations are an iterative and collaborative process to fill gaps for urgent demand and provide a bridge to solve for longer-term outcomes, but not meant as a sustainable solution to access to medicines. Programs are increasingly done in concert with capacity building and health system strengthening initiatives, and donors work in partnership with local agencies, organizations, and global NGOs to make sure the donations are used for that which they are intended. And PQMD has worked for over 21 years on the guidelines and standards that Dale mentioned that provide some of that assurance. So what is PQMD and why is it important? The Partnership for Medical Quality Donations is a global alliance committed to advancing the role of donations worldwide for better access to universal health and well-being, with 51 members representing leading international and US-based NGOs and global healthcare companies in the pharmaceutical, medical product, and device fields. Our work is guided by 5 pillars: humanitarian assistance, health system strengthening, disaster response, guidelines, and knowledge and innovation. Our donation guidelines are the foundational document of our organization that provide donors and implementers and recipient countries and governments with the standards by which they can be assured that the donations they receive have the efficacy they expect and safety to the patients that receive the critical medical aid. By virtue of our network, our members leverage partnerships, expertise, and resources to focus on building sustainability, promoting community resilience, supporting disaster preparedness and response, all while adhering to the highest standards of excellence in donation practices. And for more information, you can visit our website at pqmd.org. And we also welcome you to join our community of practice, which is cop.pqmd.org. And I can put that in the chat later. So within these guidelines, just in reference to some of the polls, whether the companies are manufacturing to give or they're providing excess product, they have to adhere to quality standards that are very similar to those in the United States. There is no counterfeit, there is no expired product, there is no dumping of product. These are all really historic problems that have really been really haven't existed now for quite some time, because it was recognized that those things can actually cause greater public health hazards than actually do good. So companies and NGOs came together and they developed these guidelines with the World Health Organization to assure that the quality of the products that are being delivered are what we would expect to have for our own families. So I want to give you a couple of examples of some of the recent donations that PQMD members have made. So I just picked COVID in Ukraine, but there's a ton of other opportunities, obviously, and other examples. But for COVID, AstraZeneca supplied about 2.5 billion doses of vaccine to more than 180 countries in 1 year, 2/3 of those to lower middle income countries. And Pfizer delivered over 1 billion vaccines to 100 lower middle income countries as well. In 2020, BMS, that's Bristol Myers Squibb, contributed $31 million in financial support and product for COVID, contributing to 45 countries. The NGO Project Hope in their COVID program reached 791,000 people in 98 countries, distributing 18 million PPEs, that's personal protection equipment, and training more than 63,000 health workers worldwide. And for Ukraine, which is, of course, the most recent, pharmaceutical companies have donated over 22 million doses of essential medicines in cash as of March 22. And companies like Pfizer, Merck, Abbott, J&J, Becton Dickinson, and many others donated both cash and product to help with immediate needs and resupply the country's health system. The donations were implemented in partnership with the Ministry of Health, local health authorities, and global and local NGOs like Direct Relief, AmeriCares, Project Hope, International Medical Corps, Heart to Heart, International Health Partners, and so many more. However, as impressive as these contributions are, I also wanted to mention that most pharmaceutical companies have substantial portfolios of donation programs for a range of diseases and events, but they also have what they call signature programs, where a company commits to a large-scale, long-term investment around a particular disease or topic. So you may be familiar with programs such as the Merck Onco program, which is 35 years old. It is designed to address river blindness. It's a river blindness elimination initiative that has provided over 4.4 billion Mectizan treatments in 29 countries, or the other corporate multi-million-dollar investments in mitigating things like dengue fever, Chagas, schisto, intestinal worms, and others. These donations are not made in isolation. In other words, not just product and money, but rather part of a broader strategy that focuses on resilience and sustainability. Companies include in these initiatives things like eliminating barriers to access, addressing supply chain management issues, infrastructure improvements, professional education and training, and in some cases, economic development, general health literacy, and more. So now I'm just going to give you a few numbers that I thought were pretty impressive. So the numbers are 274, which I already told you about, 28.6, 103, 103, 20, 80, and 500. So very quickly, again, the 274 is 274 million people are going to need humanitarian assistance. And that's up 40 million from last year, despite COVID and everything else. So that's just all kinds of horrible world disasters that are going on in humanitarian crises. 28.6, that's $1 billion in value of NTD, that's neglected tropical disease drugs, donated by Pharma to USAID, that's the United States Agency for International Development, supported countries, representing the largest public-private partnership in the agency's history. 103 is 103 years or long-term commitments of just 4 PQMD members that have made to eliminate 4 NTDs, that's sleeping sickness, lymphatic filariasis, onco, and trachoma, and with public support and NGO partners have resulted in 43 countries eliminating at least 1 NTD. 20 is the $1 billion donated globally for COVID-19 in 2020, with corporations accounting for 44% of the funding. 80 is the percentage in some countries of the total medical resources, equipment, and supplies that are donated. And that's something that maybe we'll come back to later, because that's critical. And 500 is 500 billion people are impacted by product donations around the globe. And so, Steve, over to you to explain why donations may or may not be good.
Dale, do I go ahead?
Yes.
We live in a remarkable time. In the last 30 years, during my lifetime, the treatment regimen for almost every disease you can name and every form of surgical need has turned over, has changed and improved, such that we've seen doubling of life expectancies in a lot of countries. And the technology and the drug opportunities to save lives are almost entirely new. It changes from year to year. And the aid community has been trying to play catch up with understanding what the right mix of drugs are for different diseases and how to play the game with the big pharmaceutical companies. So I wanted to first acknowledge that the Right Honorable E.J. Ashbourne, my opponent in this debate, her organization, PQMD, is a good organization. She's doing very important, critical work as she described it. But my job is to explain to you that it barely scratches the surface. Let me go back in time. And she went back in time, and I think her presentation kind of blurred a lot of changes over time. A lot of us started in the 1970s with a campaign against Nestle for promoting milk in poor, low resource countries where it displaced exclusive breastfeeding, even though we know that exclusive breastfeeding saves lives of children dramatically. So if the mother adds other things during the infant's first 6 months of life, the risk of death goes up 30 times, not 30%, 30 times. And so we began trying to promote guidelines for this. And so we created at Interaction, the big international NGO consortium, guidelines for drug donations and other donated goods, as EJ referred to, back in 1998, 99. These led to other guidelines in humanitarian aid called SPHERE, and the WHO guidelines in 1999 and more recently that EJ refers to. Nevertheless, every single emergency I go to, breast milk formula is donated. It gets in because the people who have the assumption, oh, surely it's needed, keep offering it. It was the main subject of conversation in the nutrition working group for Ukraine this year that I'm a part of. And so I teach my classes, don't worry about inappropriate donations, expect it. It is inevitable in almost every new emergency. You're all mostly aware of the 9/11 crisis. After the World Trade Center was destroyed, the American public donated tens of millions of dollars worth of dog food and bottled water and clothing to the victims of 9/11, who, by the way, were dead. And the American Red Cross couldn't give them to someone else. That would have been a scandal. They couldn't destroy them. That would have been a scandal. So they were required to store them in Long Island for years. And so EJ referred to Haiti and a lot of donations clogging. The instinct of the American community is to donate, and the reality is that a lot of donations are absurd. So let me take things down to the field level. At a refugee camp health facility, we have a pharmacy that supports the inpatient and outpatient and community health worker work. In that pharmacy, we receive donations from a wide variety of sources. We don't even know what they are most of the time. We can't name them. I mean, there are all kinds of obscure names. They come in different languages. And the labeling of the drugs not only come in different languages, they use different proprietary name for the drugs. It's a huge guessing game. Well, what is this drug? And they come in different dosages. And they don't come with a track record saying, well, this is their intent. This is for this disease or that disease. And they have, of course, different expiration dates. And so that job of hiring local staff just to untangle this big web ends up being a big drain on local teams. And in the end, that kaleidoscope of drugs often ends up leading to the destruction of a lot of drugs. In a lot of emergencies where a lot of drugs are donated, a lot of drugs are triaged and put aside at the airport of entry for eventual destruction, which is a cost to the local team. There's a guy named Claude DeVille de Goyer, who was a local resident of Maryland, right around this church for most of his career, who led the humanitarian division at the Pan American Health Organization. And his main claim to fame over his career was helping governments create this triage of what to do with all the inappropriate or not immediately appropriate drug donations at port of reception so they wouldn't get out to the field level. He also created his software systems, and his publications are widely known to this day. A lot of my work has been in food aid, and let me just sort of frame the whole industry for us. Food aid is given for a lot of purposes around the world, and I would say about half of the settings where the food aid is donated don't need food aid. They just don't need it. And that's just also true for a lot of the other donations that we give, whether it's clothing or pharmaceutical drugs. A lot of drugs are donated to seed the industry to try and, just like food aid was originally in 1960, to try to create demand for that particular drug or other supply. Just as in the United States, pharmaceutical companies have been blamed for millions of opioid deaths, which has now been a big legal issue, which you've certainly seen in the news. In 1996, Pfizer was pushing a new drug for meningitis in a meningitis epidemic in Nigeria, which didn't work out well, and lots of children died. What was the consequence of that? For the next few decades, people in Nigeria were skeptical of outside drugs for saving lives, including to immunize for polio. And so the global campaign to eradicate polio, which the US taxpayer has put tens of millions of dollars into, the Bill and Melinda Gates and Bloomberg have put billions of dollars into, has failed because local populations don't trust us because they know we have self-interest in what we're donating. And to this day, the big pharmacy companies continue to try to squelch the use of their patents for local production of local drugs. We now live, just in the last 2 years, in a period where the aid industry is interested in what we call decolonizing aid. That's true in development aid as well as emergency aid. And one of the aspects of decolonizing aid is shifting decision-making agency to the populations in question, the local people. We call them local, the people overseas. And that involves not just giving them decision-making, but giving them and their local markets the primary goal of our attention. And so it's already the case that NGOs, I'm on the board of Relief International, which does a lot of healthcare work, our first priority in obtaining drugs that are needed is to buy them locally if we can. And so the overall goal is that we would hope that pharmaceutical companies and WTO and the US government and USAID would all work toward local production of these drugs, not international shipment of those drugs. But still to this day, pharmaceutical companies resist it. Oxfam published, and I'm going to quote Robbie Silberman in a recent Oxfam UK report, the failure of rich country donations is a failure of COVAX, which is the COVID vaccine, have the same root cause. And as you all know, I'm digressing now, as you all know, people in the United States and Europe had 3 vaccines before people in Malawi or Cambodia had any vaccines. So the failure is because of the given control of vaccine to supply to a small number of pharmaceutical companies, which got, as you know, billions of dollars of business from the US and other governments, who are prioritizing their own profits. Quote, these companies can't produce enough to vaccinate the world. They are artificially constraining the supply, and they have always put their rich customers at the front of the line. They always have. I mean, it's the nature of the capitalist industry. The only way to end the pandemic is to share the technology and know-how with qualified manufacturers in India and Kenya and Peru, so that everyone everywhere can access life-saving vaccines. My esteemed colleague, the Right Honorable E.J. Vashborn, mentioned Pfizer providing lots of vaccines. I suspect that they provided them with remuneration from the U.S. government. That these were actually paid for, is my understanding. They got hundreds of millions of dollars. So who actually paid for a lot of the vaccine distributions of these countries? Just to give you the context of the donations that we were talking about, those are exceeded by purchases by USAID, which is to say taxpayers, you are paying these companies for a lot of the good work they do. And the companies we're talking about, whether it's GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, Bristol Myers, Bayer, Amgen, Merck, Novartis, they overall are an industry of over $50 billion. NGOs that I'm talking about, whether we're talking about Project Hope, which my esteemed colleague mentioned, or Relief International, we're talking about NGOs that have annual budgets of around $100 million. So several order of magnitudes lesser. Dale, how am I doing on time?
You're at about 9.5 minutes.
So I've gone over.
Just by about 15 seconds, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for both of you. And at your request, you wanted a chance first to ask each other questions. And then after that, we will have the audience questions. So please be patient, audience. There were probably some surprises in each other's presentation. So EJ, you go first and ask Steve for any clarifications.
And let me just mention, this is Loretta, that there's only one question in the chat box. If anyone has a question, please type your questions in the chat box. Thanks.
Okay.
Hi, sorry. Well, thank you. I guess I should call you Right Honorable Steve. So my colleague certainly brought up all of the classic cases that I think have a lot of history and that people know. And I think there have been bad actors in the past and a lot of learning that has gone on. And I really appreciate some of those things that you had mentioned. And I just feel compelled before I ask you a question, Steve, to just say that, the Nestle case, of course, is one of the oldest cases out there. And I think that there was a lot of learning, and you're absolutely right. There are all kinds of products that show up. And when you say expect inappropriate donations, that does happen. But that is also why the pharmaceutical industry and its partners work so closely with the governments and the NGOs that are local, and they are actually responding to express needs, and they are not getting they may be getting huge amounts of products, certainly not from PQMD members, because they are linked inextricably with the ministries of health that have needs lists, and they're responding to those needs lists. But I think that refugee camps and your experience there is so extraordinary, really does pose a whole range of challenges, because you've got mobile populations. You don't have adequate health records on many of them. It's really hard to, they are an incredibly needy population, but there are, of course, those organizations, some of which you have worked for yourself, but many that are expert at working at mobile populations and displaced people. And that is something that is really key. And the other thing that I did want to mention is that you talked about, the need for destruction, and you talked also about the need for storage and those expenses. So most of the donations now that are made, especially large scale ones, do come with funding and resources to be able to manage that kind of happening. It's unfortunate that it does happen. But part of our guidelines, of course, do include guidance on destruction and storage, and particularly cold storage and things like that. And then, of course, lastly, I just had to mention seeding the market. That is that is really something that is constantly discussed. But there is a firewall in pharmaceutical companies between their business interests and their foundations. And so, that has certainly been a criticism that has been levied in the past. But I do think that there is a lot of evidence to suggest that that is not the impetus of the industry to provide their life-saving products. And in many cases, products for rare diseases or orphan diseases that literally will never have a market in these parts of the world. And so to say they're seeding the market with them is I think, not it's not accurate, but it certainly has been a criticism levied in the past. But so my question is, though, so if, you see all these issues with donations, and if your solution is local manufacturing or, sort of releasing all the patents so they can be, manufactured and delivered locally. But in the absence of countries being able to do that, either from a capacity standpoint or, not adequate electricity or not adequate manufacturing processes, or a whole range of different issues that are limits to doing that, how do you propose that low income and resource constrained countries actually stock their health systems? When I had mentioned in my intro that in some countries, 80% of countries' medical products or medical equipment is actually donated. So how do you make up that difference, if not through donations?
We have seen in as you know, in the last 20 years, dramatic decreases in the prices of key goods by increasing demand. So 20 years ago, the cost of bed nets was about $100 per bed net. Today, it's about $1 because groups like the Bill and Melinda Gates, the Clinton Foundation have promoted expanded funding of it, which has brought the price down because there's just more of a market. And so if we were to establish networks of production in countries like India, where Cipla tries to produce a lot of essential drugs for the countries, I'm not expecting that every single country would have its own pharmaceutical production, but the developing world in general is certainly growing fast enough that they can expand with investments for production. The wherewithal is there, electricity is there, the know-how, the desire is there, the patents aren't there. I'll give an example of the Plumpyfield network. In the area of nutrition, we have something called ready-to-use therapeutic food, which is a fairly well-accepted high-value nutritional supplement that saves lives of children who are acutely malnourished. The head of USAID, Samantha Power, just last week announced a couple $100 million that USAID would be further investing for that. And so the company that created and holds the patent for the proprietary name for the ready-to-use therapeutic foods is Plumpy Nut, which Anderson Cooper famously talked about from Niger 20 years ago. Plumpy Nut is franchised out to lots and lots of local organizations, some of which are for-profit, some of which are nonprofit, between Tanzania, Malawi, different countries, Ethiopia, so that they are aggressively pushing local production with local goods. It's a delicate balancing act of how to get the local ingredients and the quality control and the processing at the local level. They are investing in the long term to see it happen. I'd love to see Johnson & Johnson do the same thing with all of their drugs, with some affiliate in every continent.
Okay, we're running a bit over on the time. So I think what we're going to do is, Steve, I know this cuts you a bit short, but we're going to use one of the audience questions, and then we will come back to you, Steve, and you will have a chance to ask EJ a question. So some of this has been addressed partially already. Do drug companies obtain tax breaks or deductions on taxes from the US government? And I think Steve has made that clear. I also had a similar question for EJ after her presentation on the vaccines that were provided, whether they were in fact free to the countries that received them, or whether there was some sort of subsidy involved. So maybe just a focused response on this from the questioner did not say to whom it was addressed, but Steve has already nodded his head and addressed it. So EJ, maybe you could address that with respect to your specific allegations about the vaccine.
Allegations. So yes, of course, the companies do receive tax benefits for their donations. They absolutely do. And as far as the vaccine, of course, was supported substantially by the U.S. government. The speed at which that mRNA vaccine was developed was as a result of a huge influx of resources from the federal government. But those vaccines went to COVAX. And they were purchased, or I'm actually not sure if there was an advanced purchase agreement in place, but there was, they were purchased at a highly subsidized rate. But then the vaccines to the countries, it's my understanding, was free. And one of the issues that I think is not talked about enough, and that is that when there were vaccines available, and certainly an outcry, and you're right, Steve, you were absolutely right when you say that that the US and Europe were certainly first in line to receive those vaccines when they were made available. But they were also sent out to countries where, of course, at the speed at which they had to be delivered and the speed at which people needed them, what didn't actually catch up with it was the capacity on the ground to be able to implement it. So there was a bunch of misunderstanding, including the fact that there was an impression by some countries, I don't want to call out specific countries really, but there were an impression by some countries that the short expiry date meant that it was no good. It was just had to do with the length of time that particular vaccine was available, and they could have used it, or they ended up destroying it or not using it at all, because they didn't have the capacity on the ground to be able to deliver it to the people. I think in the speed of all of this distribution, organizations were really quick to understand what the issues were and then move to address them. So, you know, it is learning, and a little bit disappointing just on a personal level, because I worked extensively on HIV/AIDS in the late 90s and 2000s. And there are some things that have clearly been repeated. The learnings hadn't really been I guess, fully intuited. So there is still some learnings going on, but I do think that they have moved to remedy that substantially.
Okay, another question.
Dale, Dale, if you want me to summarize that first question, it's rather lengthy, about research.
Okay, I was going to just ask the question, which is short, about is it better to donate to the Red Cross?
Is it better for whom to donate to the Red Cross? The public, individuals, or companies?
I think the question probably meant for citizens.
For those of us making donations, I think.
Well, you're not going to donate to a pharmaceutical company. You'd be donating to some international NGO, of which the American Red Cross, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and the International Committee of the Red Cross are all excellent choices.
I think
And I'll just throw in, so is Direct Relief, so is Project Hope, so are all of the other international nonprofits that are out there. Absolutely, because they are organizing how the product goes to the country, and they are responding to express needs of the country so that they can organize and coordinate and ensure that the products that are most needed and appropriate are getting to the countries that actually need it.
Sorry, go ahead.
If I could just unpack this a little bit, there are different types of NGOs. My honorable colleague E.J. Ashburn mentioned Direct Relief based in Santa Barbara, California. There's also AmeriCares based in Connecticut. There's also MAP International based in Baltimore. Those NGOs specialize in getting drug donations from the big pharma companies, and then their annual report is almost entirely drug donations and the dollar valuation of them. And then they partner with implementing NGOs in the field, like International Medical Corps, Relief National, who actually then use them. And so there's a lot of intermediation that occurs. The American Red Cross is kind of in a special category. They get stuff because their name is so well known that they don't want. As Dr. Kobe knows well, when the United States government decided to invade Afghanistan, the President of the United States, George Bush, on national primetime TV said to American people, please donate to the American Red Cross. The American Red Cross wasn't in Afghanistan. They faced a huge public relations challenge where they immediately had to start turning around and trying to figure out how to redonate onto other NGOs that were in Afghanistan. Yeah. The American Red Cross is a great organization, but they have this special status that everyone thinks of them first when maybe they're not actually relevant in the field.
Yeah. We actually have a Contemporary Issues Forum on American Red Cross in February. And I worked there, and I could elaborate on that. But Loretta, go ahead and
so
the complex one.
The lengthy question is aimed at research, and I don't know if either of you wants to address research or not. But the question is, what role does large pharmaceutical research play in bringing safe and effective drugs to the world, and in particular low and middle income populations? So I think it's probably that latter piece that the questioner.
If I can just interject, because that doesn't fully really ask the question to my two honorable colleagues here, and which is the comment that Dr. Hensch made about the problem being pharmaceutical patents existing in the developing countries. Therefore, there's no ability to have generic manufacturing available. But that, I would posit, flies in the face of the facts in which, according to the statistics that I've read, only 7% of those considered to be the most essential medicines needed in health systems, particularly in developing countries and emerging markets, are in fact patented. Those medicines were developed, they were researched, they were brought to market by the research-based pharmaceutical industry, but now they're generic, available, affordable. So what is the problem or the issue with the research-based pharmaceutical industry in this domain? Some of these are now, by the way, products that are donated.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, David. Excellent point. So there are, I think there is a constant, that is a constant challenge for pharmaceutical companies, but also for the perception in the public on what pharmaceutical companies are kind of holding close to their chest and not actually giving to countries unless they're paid. I think this was a question that Steve and I have actually, or excuse me, Dr. Hench and I actually have discussed, why don't they just give the patents to the countries? And the reality is that is, of course, challenging the entire business model of the pharmaceutical industry, which I think is a whole different topic and one that we probably don't want to discuss right now. But in the case of HIV/AIDS, if you recall way back when, the pharmaceutical companies actually partnered in investing in generic companies to produce the drugs for HIV/AIDS. And so they did release the patents on those, and they did so by investing in the actual generic companies to do it. And then I just think that there is Pfizer. I know that we've said a few things about Pfizer, but about a couple of months ago, they announced in Rwanda an accord for a healthier world to improve health equity, where they're going to provide 23 essential drugs to 45 lower and middle income countries. And many of those drugs are patented, but they're going to be providing them at a not-for-profit cost to the countries who need it. And they had the signature of several African presidents. So I think there is an interest in trying to work effectively with patented drugs. And then when they go off patent or they're essential, then they go to generic companies where the original manufacturers are overseeing the quality assurance of the drugs that are getting out there, because that is actually the key, right? I mean, you have lots of generic companies. This is something that happens in donations. I think Dr. Hench mentioned as well, and some of you mentioned in your poll that you thought that there were substandard product. Very often those are not coming from the actual manufacturer company. These are coming from the generic companies that are trying to copy these products without adequate oversight. So thank you, David. That was a really good question.
Let me also reply to David. I don't deny anything that David is saying. Groups like Merck, where David used to work, have done fantastic research on neglected tropical disease solutions. No question about that. But let's look at this from a larger point of view. People in the global health industry, people at WHO and the NGO world, are aware that for a lot of those neglected diseases, there is very little market for it. There's just not much money and therefore very little research. Most of the pharmaceutical company research, which is invaluable for saving lives, is for those diseases of the developed world. And so it's a market failure. It's not to criticize the pharmaceutical companies per se, but so when the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation says we want a solution for malaria, like a malaria vaccine, they respond with a market solution. They say, we will pay that finder of that solution a lot of money, but it then becomes a public good and can be used everywhere. And that's kind of how the US government is moving also in trying to find solutions through a global marketplace, like putting the money there. But it's still a huge gap.
Yeah, that's an excellent point that I was going to make, that when you're talking medicines, you're talking inherently of public-private partnership, because you need the incentives to produce the medicines, but it becomes a public good. The objectives are public goods. We have just a quick question, which is to repeat the organizations that are better than the Red Cross for Afghanistan, Steve.
This is not a good question. The ICRC does absolutely fantastic work everywhere they work, and they work in Afghanistan. So, and they are one of the Red Cross branches.
Okay.
It's very hard to rank NGOs because they all have very different designs, modes of implementation. So I could give you my opinions, but David's group would give a different opinion. There's a lot of different answers to that question. I'm happy to chat about that offline or after the hour's over.
Yeah. Okay, I agree with you. All right, so I think those are all the questions except for one I had. So I will go back to Steve and give him his due, which is to pose a question to EJ based on what she said.
I'm trying to find my questions. EJ, you know what they are. Go ahead.
So one of Dr. Hench's questions, I mean, we're sort of bouncing around, actually touching on some of the discussion.
It's okay. I just felt guilty.
No worries.
Probably
No
it will
worries.
come out in my question, Steve, which is, can we talk a little bit about the challenges of measuring the impact of in-kind donations? The fact that you do sometimes have to take account of waste, logistical costs, for example, the challenges of valuation. So why don't we, Steve, do you have views on that?
Well, as you know, to do a good impact study, you need a counterfactual. The World Food Program is doing studies. I've done an evaluation with them of comparing cash donations versus providing international food from the United States. In terms of the impact on dietary diversity, the cost efficiency, the value is perceived by the beneficiaries. And it's tricky. It varies all over the map. And there are some cases where the local market just doesn't exist. And so at that moment in time, it's better to bring it in. What's much more insidious is the long-term effects, because so much of our industry is perpetually short-term. We're always doing the short-term answer to a short-term problem. And in the long term, that means that local capacities are not built up because we keep bringing in outside stuff. And we don't have good measures of that.
Okay. EJ,
Yeah,
anything to add?
I think what Dr. Hunt said is absolutely correct. And that is that whether it's a counterfactual or you need a baseline. So for, gifts in kind that come in for a disaster, it is very challenging to actually figure out the impact because you don't have the baseline necessarily. You might. But on the other hand, we have at PQMD okay, thanks for the correction. At PQMD, we have something called Measuring for Success, which is a toolkit that we use for organizations or any of our member organizations or any of organizations that are interested. It is a global public good. And it had, in true disclosure, Dale was part of developing it. And it is to look at how do you measure the impact? What are the metrics you use to measure the impact of gifts in kind and donations? And it is a moving target. And when we went to look across industry, in the pharmaceutical industry and also NGOs, at what kind of resources were out there in terms of impact evaluation, they were really varied, and people were measuring different things. They were looking, and we were just speaking earlier, they were measuring donations in terms of pounds versus in terms of treatments, in terms of financial investments. So it was very hard to compare across the board what the impact was. We are starting a new program called the Aligned Metrics Initiative within PQMD. If anybody is interested in joining that, we would be very happy to include you to look at how do we align metrics across the industry to be able to effectively measure the impact and figure out what all these donations are doing in terms of improving health outcomes. I do think individual programs do have this information, but it is, you have to really have dedicated resources in each program to be able to really measure effectively.
Yeah,
I have found in-kind donations often clog things up in the way. I've had people want to donate mattresses to people in Cambodia who've never slept on mattresses in their entire life.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Yeah, this is like the ice skates in Haiti that I was talking about. You're absolutely right. On the other hand, I participated in in the opening of a free clinic in Baltimore, in a particularly hard area in Baltimore for those people who are uninsured or uninsurable. And the products in there, all of the equipment, all of the treatments, all of the surgical capacity, even the dental clinics were all donated. And this was providing, very appropriate, very specific resources for a population that really needed it. So that was all in kind. So you have to be so important. And it is what my right honorable colleague has said at the beginning, that, you can expect inappropriate contributions, but that's why it's so critical to be responding to a government or responding to a needs list or responding to and working in partnership with local organizations that can sort of give you a heads up as to what is appropriate and what's not. You don't want to really be opening up pallets of mattresses in Cambodia.
So let me
right?
get back to the core question that I had of localization.
We are running into a time constraint,
I'll ask
so
my question very quickly. So my question for EJ is, what are your members, the big pharma companies, doing to support local production by local companies in where they exist in terms of waiving patents or sharing patents?
Well, I think that they are working, as I say, with the governments and with their counterparts, with their implementers to explore whether or not there are opportunities to be able to localize some production. They are certainly having conversations at the global level, whether it be in the World Economic Forum or with WHO, on how to go about doing it best. It tends to be very disease specific, and it certainly tends to be product specific. So there is, and if not local manufacturing, then building the capacity of the health workers and the health workforce within those countries to be able to manage the products that are coming in.
okay. I promised I would make 2 comments, and then we need to come back to the polls. First of all, Steve Hanch is neither a medical doctor nor has a PhD. He has a master's in public health, so he is not a Dr. Hanch. Second, a member of our congregation, Bruce Benton, who worked at the World Bank and was responsible for the river blindness program. So let's take some credit for one of our talented members of the congregation. Unfortunately, he's not here. Okay, Natalie, can we repeat the poll and then we'll see if there's been any shift?
Well, one shift you're going to have is you got more people online now.
We do?
So more people to better understand that donations are a critical part of global health.
Okay. People are still voting. 62%, 70, 31. So we have 101%. Okay, so I think we're done.
101.
Poll 2. Okay, here we do see an increased learning, which was one of the objectives of the debate. Before, there were some disagrees or strongly disagrees. So there's a better understanding of the pros and cons. Okay, poll 3. Okay, this is not a mutually exclusive type questionnaire. So we can't add up the percentages, but I believe there has been an increase in those choosing medicines are of the highest quality. So that represents some learning. There are, however, still some skeptics who say that the pharmaceuticals are providing expired or close to expired products. And correct me if I'm wrong, EJ, but some of PQMD members do manufacture to give expressly, and some are giving excess product. But in both cases, they are following the standards, right?
Yes, absolutely. And in many cases, they're doing both.
Yeah.
But they
Okay.
abide by the expiry dates of the FDA most often, and most African countries and other countries around the world will not take products less than a year of expiry. And that is, that's pretty universal. And one last thing, I just wanted to quickly mention for the person who had talked about giving to NGOs. In many cases, if not all, NGOs will not actually take products that they cannot distribute. So they're not going to take expired product or short dated product or products that are not part of a needs list of some program that they're working in some part of the world. So when I think it was the Red Cross question. So they don't just take everything, because whether it's the country or the NGO, they have to store it or they have to destroy it. So if they can't actually use it, so those NGOs won't actually take the product that they can't use.
Yeah. And just very quickly, the Red Cross works through local societies. You know, in Jamaica, there's a local Red Cross society. In the Philippines, there's a local Red Cross society. So that automatically provides some local input. Okay, and here's the final. Let me vote. I want to give everybody enough time to vote. Okay, it's 100% answers. And we do seem to have a bit of a shift that not that many people are stressing overwhelmingly an issue with messing with local markets and storage and logistics costs, but there is an understanding that it's situational. There can be positive and there can be negative impacts. Okay. All right. So let's thank our speakers, and we'll end the formal recording here. And if there are further questions,